The pump coughed in the wet field. Mud pulled at a farmer's boots. Then the sky tore open, and something burning came down where no one was supposed to be watching. Thank you for joining me. Get comfortable, and let this strange morning carry you into the story. The rain had stopped before sunrise, but Ford Hollow Farm was still drowning. Water lay in the low field like dull glass. Broken corn stalks floated along the rows. Mud pulled at Wesley Ford's boots with every step, and the old pump at the edge of the field coughed like it was trying to die with dignity. Wesley crouched beside it with a wrench in one hand and a flashlight between his teeth. His coat was soaked through. His fingers were numb. The pump's casing had cracked during the night, and the belt had slipped off the wheel again. "Not today," he muttered. The pump answered with a metallic clunk and a tired rattle. Wesley shut his eyes for 1 second. No more. If the pump failed, the north field would stay underwater. If the north field stayed underwater, the last planting would rot before it took root. If that happened, County Trust Bank would not wait another month. They had already waited longer than they wanted to. Ford Hollow Farm had belonged to his family for 3 generations. On paper, it was 86 tired acres, 1 farmhouse with a sagging porch, 2 barns, a rusting machine shed, and soil that had lost more than it had gained for too many years. To Wesley, it was his father's hands on a steering wheel, his mother's jars cooling on the kitchen counter, and every fence post he had set when he was too young to know how hard life could lean on a man. The bank saw overdue numbers. Wesley tightened the belt, braced one knee in the mud, and pulled the starter cord. The pump shuddered. It spat brown water through the outlet pipe, then caught. "That's it," Wesley said softly. "Keep breathing." A sound split the morning. It was not thunder. Thunder rolled. This tore. Wesley looked up as a line of fire crossed the gray sky. It came low over the tree line, silent for half a breath, then screaming. It struck the far end of the flooded field and dragged a glowing wound through the mud before, vanishing behind a rise of broken corn. The pump kept chugging behind him. Wesley stood in the rain-wet field, watching steam rise where the thing had fallen. No one in that part of the county had money enough for private air traffic. Satellites fell now and then. Space junk came down over the oceans most of the time. Once, a weather drone had landed in Old Man Pell's hay field, and everyone had talked about it for a month. This was not a weather drone. Wesley killed the pump, grabbed the pry bar from the bed of his truck, and crossed the field. Mud sucked at his boots. The air smelled of burned metal and wet earth. Halfway there, he saw the object clearly. It was a pod, not a ship, not a military craft. A pod no longer than a grain trailer, blackened on one side, cracked along the nose, its outer shell dented and blistered from heat. Strange symbols ran along the hatch, but half of them had burned away. A thin sound came from inside. Wesley stopped. It was not an alarm. It was a voice. He jammed the pry bar into the hatch seam and leaned his weight into it. The metal resisted. He tried again. The latch broke with a sharp snap, and the hatch sagged open. Cold vapor rolled out. Inside the pod, 4 figures huddled together in the dim emergency light. They were not human, but they looked close enough for fear to translate. The oldest one was a thin woman with pale, green-gray skin and silver hair braided tight to her skull. Her arms wrapped around a clay-colored jar bound in torn cloth. A man lay half across the floor, one side dark with blood. A woman held him up, whispering in a language Wesley did not know. In front of them, a younger woman pushed herself to her knees. She was tall and slight, with wide amber eyes and dark markings like fine root lines along her temples. Even half frozen and shaking, she put herself between Wesley and the jar. "Please," she said in strained English. "Not the jar." Wesley lowered the pry bar. "I'm not here for the jar." Her eyes searched his face as if she had heard kind words before and had learned not to trust them. The old woman coughed. The injured man tried to move and failed. Wesley looked back across the field. No cars moved on the road. No neighbors were close enough to see. No sirens had found the farm yet. He had no room for strangers and no money for trouble. He had a bank letter folded on the kitchen table that said the farm could be taken within days. Then the young woman shifted, and Wesley saw her hands. They were wrapped around the jar too, not because she wanted to keep it from him, but because she was holding the old woman's hand steady. Wesley climbed into the pod. "My name is Wesley Ford," he said. "You're on my farm. I'm going to get you out before this thing catches fire." The young woman blinked. The injured man whispered something. Wesley pointed to him. "He comes first." The young woman hesitated, then moved aside. By the time the sun cleared the clouds, Wesley had moved 4 refugees from another world through mud and rainwater into his old north barn. He covered the pod with a tarp, then threw muddy straw over the scorched trail where he could. It was a poor hiding job, but it was better than leaving a black scar across the field for the first passing truck to see. The north barn smelled of hay dust, old oil, and wetwood. The roof leaked in 3 places. Wesley set buckets under 2 leaks and ignored the third. The family sat near a space heater that had not been safe since 1998. Wesley had rewired it twice. He trusted it more than he trusted the bank. The young woman watched him with the jar in her lap. The old woman sat beside her. The mother wrapped the injured man's side with strips of clean cloth Wesley had cut from a sheet. The wound was not deep, but the crash had hit him hard. Wesley brought water, bread, and a bowl of warm broth from the house. The family watched every movement, and they did not eat until the old woman touched the bowl first. The younger woman noticed him noticing. "We are not ungrateful," she said. Her voice was soft, but not weak. "We have learned to be careful. I understand careful." "No," she said. "I hope you do not." Wesley set a lantern on an overturned feed bucket. "What is your name?" "Soha. Vey." She touched the old woman's shoulder. "My grandmother, Noma Vey. My father, Dallin. My mother, Mira." "Wesley Ford," he said again. "This is Ford Hollow." "Earth," Sarah said. "Yes." Noma looked up at that word. Her fingers tightened around the jar. Sarah followed Wesley's gaze. She unwrapped the cloth just enough to show him what was inside. Seeds. Not jewels. Not weapons. Not a power core. Seeds the size of beans, pale brown with faint green seams. A few were healthy, hard and smooth. Others had dark spots along the shell. Wesley leaned closer. "They are molding," he said. "Cela est fast changed." Whatever fear she had of him became fear of something worse. She took one seed out and held it against her palm. A faint light pulsed inside the seam. Wesley had never seen a seed glow. Noma whispered a phrase in her language. It sounded like prayer and apology at the same time. "How long?" Wesley asked. Sarah looked at him. "If we do nothing, less than 3 days," she said. "Maybe less. 3 days until what?" "Until the heart inside dies." Wesley looked from her to the jar, then to the water still dripping from the barn roof. The farm needed saving. The bank needed paying. The pump needed parts. Wesley had less than $200 in his checking account, and half of that was already spoken for. He still heard himself ask, "What do they need?" Sarah stared at him as if the question hurt. "Living soil," she said. "Clean water. Warmth that does not jump too high. Darkness at first, then morning light. And no signal." "What signal?" Dallin stirred. His voice was rough. "When they wake, Helix hears." Sarah looked at her father sharply. Wesley kept his face still. "Helix Agrary," Sarah said. "They own the seeds." "That is what they say." Noma made a low sound. "Sera collecté d'herself." "They say they own the seeds." Wesley stood and looked around the barn. He had a cracked grain dryer in the machine's shed, sheets of greenhouse plastic with holes in them, a stack of broken window glass, old wire mesh, and enough scrap to make something ugly but useful. He looked at the jar again. "Living soil," he said. "Clean water. Steady heat. No signal. Sera no dead." Wesley took off his wet cap and wrung water from the brim. "Then we start there?" By mid-morning, Wesley had turned the back corner of the barn into the ugliest nursery in 3 counties, and it was the only chance the seeds had. He dragged in the old grain dryer and took the cover off. The heater coil still worked if someone watched it and did not trust the thermostat. He set 2 cracked storm windows against hay bales to trap warmth. He hung greenhouse plastic from rafters with baling twine. He filled shallow seed trays with the best soil he had left, taken from the south rise where the flood had not reached. Sarah worked beside him, weak from hunger, but precise. She refused to sit after the first hour. She touched each handful of soil before he spread it, then shook her head or nodded. Too sour, she said once. Wesley added wood ash. Too dead. He added compost from a pile behind the cow shed. Too wet. He mixed in dry soil from sacks he had been saving. After a while, he stopped asking how she knew. She knew the way he knew a storm was wrong, by the smell of wind. It was not magic. It was a life spent listening to something most people stepped on. Noma sat near the heat, wrapped in a quilt, and spoke in a low voice. Sarah translated when she could. Our village was Luma Field, Sarah said. On Orvanna. My grandmother says the old seed liked the first cold after flood season. Not full winter. Not summer heat. A soft cold that told it to rest, then a warm breath to wake. Wesley adjusted the dryer coil lower. Luma Field, he repeated. A farming village? Yes. Before Helix came, every house kept seed. My grandmother says a family that had no seed was not poor. It was unfinished. Noma heard that and gave a tired nod. Mira worked quietly over Dallin, changing the bandage and keeping him awake. She accepted no more food until Wesley set a second bowl in her hand and said, If you fall over, I have 5 problems instead of 4. For the first time, Sarah almost smiled. Near noon, Wesley went to the house for more towels and found the white envelope from County Trust Bank where he had left it. Final notice. The words seemed larger in daylight. He had 6 days before the bank filed for possession. Less if the flood made the bank decide the property needed to be protected from further loss. He had been trying to buy time with a final planting, but the storm had taken that plan by the throat. He folded the letter and put it in his coat. When he returned to the barn, Sarah was kneeling over the seed trays with one of the glowing seeds in her hand. Not yet, Noma said in English, slow and careful. Serais jotaitund. If we wait, the mold reaches the seam. Noma shook her head. What happens if you plant it too soon? Wesley asked. Sarah looked down. It wakes scared. Wesley had heard farmers talk that way about plants. City people laughed at it. Farmers usually did not. What does a scared seed do? It calls. Dallin opened his eyes. It calls home. Sarah did not correct him. Wesley looked toward the covered pod in the field beyond the barn wall. And Helix Agrary can hear that call. Yes. How far? Sarah did not answer right away. That told him enough. He spent the next hour wrapping the back of the barn in old wire mesh. He pulled it from fence rolls, window screens, broken cages, anything metal he could scavenge. It would not stop a real scan if whoever was looking knew exactly where to aim, but might blur the first whisper long enough to matter. We climbed down from the ladder. Ruth Miller was standing in the open barn door. Ruth lived on the next farm over. She was a widow with a spine like a steel rod and a habit of seeing more than she mentioned. She looked at the wire mesh, the plastic curtains, the strange family by the heater, and the jar in Sarah's hands. Wesley stepped between Ruth and the others. Morning, Ruth. It is past noon, then afternoon. She did not smile. Something fell in your field. Looks that way. That something have people in it. Wesley wiped his hands on his jeans. It had a family in it. Ruth's eyes moved to Sarah. Sarah stood slowly, even though she swayed. She held the jar with both hands and lifted her chin. Ruth said, Are they dangerous? No. Are the people looking for them dangerous? Wesley was silent. Ruth took that as an answer. Her face hardened, but not in anger at the family. It was the look of someone calculating the size of trouble and not liking the math. You know the bank is watching your place. I know. You know if the county gets a biohazard notice, they can lock the whole farm before the bank even does. I know that too. Then what are you doing? Wesley looked back at the seed trays under their trembling sheet of plastic, trying to keep something alive. Ruth stared at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Noma, who had taken one piece of bread from the plate and broken it into 4 smaller pieces before eating any herself. Ruth's expression changed by half an inch. She turned and walked away. Sarah released a breath. Will she call them? Wesley watched Ruth cross the muddy yard. I do not know. Ruth came back 10 minutes later with 2 wool blankets, a jar of soup, and a roll of duct tape. She set them inside the door. I did not see a thing, she said. Then she looked at Wesley. And you are a fool. Yes, ma'am. I mean it. I know. Ruth left before anyone could thank her. Late that afternoon, Wesley brought Sarah to the farmhouse because the barn heater needed 5 minutes to cool before he rewired it again. She walked carefully, one hand on the porch rail, the other still near the jar, even though Noma had it in the barn. Her steps were steady by force, not by health. The farmhouse was clean in the way poor houses are clean when pride has outlived money. The floorboards were worn pale in the middle. The kitchen table had one leg braced with a block of wood. A calendar from the feed store hung on the wall, 3 months behind because Wesley had stopped wanting to look at dates. Sarah noticed the envelope before he could move it. "That mark," she said. "It is a debt notice." Wesley looked at the county trust logo. "You read English that well?" "Not all words. But debt marks look the same on every world." He almost smiled, but the truth in it took the smile away. "Bank says I am behind." "Behind what?" "Payments. They lent money against the land. If I cannot pay, they take it." Sarah looked out the kitchen window toward the field. "You grow food here." "I try." "Then how can they take the ground from the person who keeps it alive?" Wesley took 2 mugs from the cabinet. "On Earth, we have many ways to make simple things complicated." He poured coffee for himself and warm water for her. She wrapped both hands around the mug as if she had not felt safe heat in a long time. "On Orvanna," she said, "Helix did not take the fields first. They took the next season. Everyone thought the ground was still ours because our feet stood on it. Then spring came, and we had no legal seed. A field without seed is only a memory." Wesley sat across from her. For a few moments, neither spoke. The house creaked in the wet wind. Somewhere in the walls, water dripped into a pan he had forgotten to empty. Sarah looked at a framed photograph above the stove. A young Wesley stood beside an older man in a field of waist-high corn. Both were the same tired grin. "Your father?" "Yes. He taught you soil. He taught me how to listen before I touched it. Said dirt tells on you if you rush. Sci is fast suftend." Noma says the same. She says careless hands make frightened roots. Wesley looked down at his hands. They were cracked, dirty at the nails, scarred from wire and machinery. "Then your grandmother and my father would have gotten along." Sarah's gaze moved back to the bank letter. "You are helping us while they're taking this from you." "Trying to take it. Because of money. Because of money." She swallowed. "Wesley Ford, if Helix offers you enough to keep this place, you should think before you answer." "I do think." "No, I mean think without looking at us." He met her eyes. "That is not how thinking works after you have seen people." She looked away first. When they returned to the barn, Wesley carried the bank envelope in his coat pocket instead of leaving it on the table. It felt heavier there than any tool, and he did not hide it from himself again. Every time he bent over the seed trays, every time he cut wire or patched plastic, he felt the paper press against his chest. It reminded him that kindness was not a feeling. It was a bill coming due. That evening, as the barn darkened, Sarah told Wesley the rest. It did not come all at once. It did not come like a speech. It came in pieces while they worked. Orvanna had once grown enough food for itself. Luma Field had been poor, but not hungry in the way it became hungry later. Then came the drought. Helix Agrary arrived with ships full of seed and tanks of water. Their agents brought contracts printed in clean letters and promises of recovery. The first season saved lives. The second season brought debt. By the 5th, every field in Luma Field grew Helix seed. The company registered the crop as a protected biological product. Every seed from every harvest had to be returned. Families could keep grain to eat, but not seed to plant. If a child found fallen seed in a cart track and took it home, that family owed a penalty. If an old woman saved seed in a clay jar, she was named a thief. "Thief," Noma said in English, as if it were a stone in her mouth. Sarah looked at her grandmother's hands. "They made us buy back the next season. We grew food we could not keep alive without permission." Wesley thought of the bank letter in his coat. Different words. Same shape. "Why run now?" he asked. Sarah's eyes lowered. "I worked in a Helix storehouse. I read seed by touch. They used me because I could separate strong stock from weak. I told myself I was keeping good seed from being destroyed. But I saw jars from villages that had no Helix mark before the drought. Old jars. Family jars. They took them, coated them, and called them recovered corporate stock. She touched the jar in Noma's lap. This was my grandmother's. I found the record. Helix did not create our seed. They took it, changed it, and sold it back to us. Noma said something in Orvanna's language. Her voice shook. Sera translated. She says a people without seed must kneel every spring. Wesley looked at the trays. Then we make sure these do not die. The first planting attempt failed before midnight. The seed swelled too fast. Its shell darkened, then split in a bad place. Sarah took it from the soil with a sound that was almost a gasp. Inside the pail, root had browned before it could reach down. Noma closed her eyes. Mira put a hand on Sarah's shoulder. Wesley wanted to say something useful, but nothing came. Sarah wrapped the dead seed in cloth and set it beside the jar. It woke scared. Wesley went outside and stood under the eave while rain ticked from the roof. The north field shone under the evening sky. The pump had stopped again. He could hear his father's voice in memory. When one thing breaks, fix the thing that feeds the other things. He went to the machine shed and worked until after midnight. He stripped the pump, cleaned mud from the intake, patched the cracked casing with a metal plate and sealant he had been saving for the tractor, and rigged a hand valve so the water flow would stop surging. He carried 2 buckets of silt from the flooded field and let them settle. Under the top layer of brown water was fine black mud, rich with washed-down life from the rise. When he brought it to Sarah, she touched it and looked up. This, she said, this is closer. It came from where the field drowned. Orvanna seed sleeps under flood silt. Wesley almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because for once the farm's disaster had become useful. They changed the trays. Noma corrected the depth. Mira warmed the water with her hands wrapped around the jar, using a small heat stone from the pod. Dallin, pale but awake, took apart a panel from the pod's emergency system and gave Wesley a power cell no bigger than a fist. It will pulse low, Dallin said. Not steady, like morning through cloud. Wesley wired it into the heater with more hope than confidence. The second seed did not glow at once. It rested. For 6 hours, nothing happened. Then, just before dawn, Sarah leaned close and froze. The seam along the seed softened. A pale line appeared. Not light this time. Movement. A root no thicker than a thread pushed into the black mud. Noma began to cry without sound. Wesley let out the breath he had been holding. The barn was so quiet that the pump outside seemed loud. Sarah's face changed from joy to fear. The signal, she whispered. The small meter Dallin had built from the pod panel blinked once. Then, twice. Then red. Before noon, while the new route was still thinner than thread, a black car came down the gravel road. It was too clean for Ford Hollow. The tires were clean. The glass was clean. There was no mud on the doors. The car stopped at the yard gate, and a man stepped out in a dark coat that shed the damp air like water off plastic. Wesley met him halfway between the house and the barn. The man carried a folder. He did not look around like someone seeing a poor farm. He looked around like someone assessing property. Wesley Ford, he asked. That's me. Victor Sloan. Helix Agrary Recovery Division. Recovery of what? Sloan smiled politely. Biological assets. Wesley heard movement in the barn behind him. He did not turn. Sloan opened the folder and held out a page covered in clean print. A registered Helix seed vessel was traced to this property after an unauthorized escape from Orvanna agricultural territory. The individuals transporting it are under contract restriction. We are here to recover company property and prevent contamination of local soil. That is a lot of words for a jar of seeds. They are not merely seeds, Mr. Ford. No, Wesley said. They are not. Sloan's eyes sharpened, but his voice stayed smooth. Then you understand the seriousness. I understand you lost something. We own something. Wesley looked at the folder. You own food. We own protected biological stock. And the people who grew it, the Vey family, are not being harmed. They are subject to contract return. Contract return, Wesley repeated. It is a standard term. Sounds better than hunted. For the first time, Sloan's smile thinned. A second car pulled in behind the first. A county truck followed it. The man who stepped out of the truck was Paul Wren from the local emergency office. Wesley had known him since high school. Paul looked unhappy before he even reached the gate. "Wes," Paul said, "I got a notice. From him. From state biohazard routing. Says there may be unregistered off-world biological material on the property." Sloan spoke before Wesley could. "We are prepared to resolve the matter quietly. Helix Agrary has no interest in disrupting local life." Wesley looked at the county truck, then at the clean black car. "Funny way to show it." Sloan took another paper from the folder. "Mr. Ford, I am aware your farm is in financial distress." Paul shifted uncomfortably. Wesley did not move. "Helix Agrary is prepared to purchase a containment easement from you," Sloan continued. "The amount would cover all outstanding obligations to County Trust Bank, repairs to flood-damaged infrastructure, and replacement of critical equipment. In exchange, you will transfer the seed vessel and the contract individuals to our custody." The yard seemed to grow very still. Wesley could hear the pump in the distance, the patched casing knocking. "Contract individuals," he said. "That is their legal status. One of them is an old woman. One is injured. They will receive appropriate transport. Back to Orvanna, to the proper jurisdiction." Wesley looked past Sloan at the north barn. Behind those boards, a root thinner than a hair was holding on in flood mud. "How much?" Wesley asked. Sloan named a number. It was more money than Wesley had ever seen connected to his name. Enough to pay the bank. Enough to fix the roof. Enough to buy a new pump, new seed, new fencing, new tires for the tractor. Enough to turn Ford Hollow from a sinking place back into something that might last. For a few seconds, Wesley saw what that money could do. The porch straightened. The barn roof sealed. The field drained. The letters from County Trust Bank vanished from his table. His father's land safe. All he had to do was hand over a jar and the people clinging to it. Sloan must have seen something in his face, because his voice softened. "You're not responsible for galactic disputes, Mr. Ford. You're a farmer in debt. Let us take back what belongs to us, and we will leave your life better than we found it." From the barn came a small sound. Not loud. A bucket shifting. Wesley folded the paper once and handed it back. His answer was not ready, but his conscience had already started choosing. "I need a day." Sloan studied him. "For what?" "To think like a farmer." "I do not understand." "That's clear." Paul looked away. Sloan took the paper. "You have until morning. After that, we request formal containment." When the cars left, Wesley stood in the yard until he could no longer hear them. Inside the barn, the Vey family had heard everything. Dallin pushed himself upright against Myra's protests. "We go." "No," Sarah said. Dallin looked at her. "We will not take his land." Myra's eyes were wet, but her voice was steady. "He has a family here, even if they are gone. Walls remember. Fields remember." Noma held the jar in both hands. "If Helix takes the route, Luma Field has no name." Sarah turned to Wesley. "You should give us to him." Wesley took off his cap. His hair was wet with sweat and rain. "Is that what you want?" "No." "Then do not ask me to call it mercy." Sera flushed. Wesley softened his voice. "I am not saying I know how this ends. I'm saying I know what he is buying. He is not buying a jar. He is buying my silence." That night, before Sloan's deadline, Sarah disappeared. Wesley found the barn door open before dawn. The jar was gone. So was Sarah's coat. He did not wake the others. He took the lantern and followed the soft prints through the mud toward the south rise. He found her at the edge of the flooded field, standing where the pod had torn the earth. The jar was wrapped in cloth against her chest. She did not turn when he approached. "If I leave before morning," she said, "your farm is only damaged, not guilty. Where will you go?" "Away from your land." "To what soil?" She looked at the dark fields. "The seed will die," Wesley said. "Maybe. No, maybe. That root is in my barn because the flood silt worked. Because your grandmother knew the cold. Because your father wired the heat. Because your mother kept him alive. Because you knew which seed to trust. You leave now, and all that goes with you into the road." Sarah's shoulders tightened. "I sorted their seeds," she said. "I put their marks on jars. I told myself I was helping families get stronger seed. I did not ask why the old jars never came back. You were trapped. I was useful. That is worse." Wesley stood beside her, not too close. "My father used to sell corn to a broker who..." Cheated half the county. He knew it by the end. Still sold because we needed the money. Being poor makes people help build the thing that squeezes them. That does not mean the thing is right. Sarah turned then. The first gray light showed the root-like markings along her temples and the exhaustion in her eyes. If I stay, you may lose your land. Wesley looked across Ford Hollow Farm. The flooded rows. The leaning fence. The barn roof patched with tin from 3 different decades. I'm already losing it, he said. At least this way I decide what it is for. She held the jar tighter. He pointed toward the barn. Out there, no soil is waiting for that seed. In there it is. Sarah closed her eyes. When she opened them, she walked back with him. By morning, after Sarah had returned with the jar, Ruth Miller was in the yard with Frank Bell, the local mechanic. Frank had a beard like steel wool and a toolbox older than some cars. I told him your pump sounded like a dying cow, Ruth said. Frank looked past Wesley toward the barn. And she told me not to ask why you need a grain dryer fixed inside a barn in June. Can you fix it? Frank spat into the mud. I can fix anything ugly. Pretty things give me trouble. Inside the barn, Frank saw the Vey family and the glowing seed trays. He stopped just long enough to take it in. Then he said, well, that is ugly enough. He got to work. Ruth called Helen Ward next. Helen had taught agricultural science at the county school for 30 years. Half the farmers in the area had learned soil testing from her, whether they admitted it or not. She arrived with a magnifying lens, a field kit, and the expression of a woman who did not appreciate nonsense. When Sarah showed her the root, Helen stopped breathing for a moment. This is not a hybrid mark, Helen said. Sarah looked up sharply. You see it. I see growth that does not match a proprietary insertion pattern. I see root memory. Sarah's eyes filled with something close to hope. Helen looked at Wesley. This is evidence. Of what? That Mr. Sloan may be trying to recover the proof before anyone qualified can look at it. Can you stop him? Helen's mouth tightened. I teach dirt. I do not stop corporations. Ruth folded her arms. Who does? Helen thought for 3 seconds. Grace Holloway. Grace Holloway answered Helen's call on the 4th ring. By noon, she was on a video screen propped on a hay bale, her face sharp and tired under office lights somewhere far from Fort Hollow. Tell me exactly what is on your property, Grace said. Wesley told her. Sarah corrected the parts he did not understand. Helen described the root. Grace listened without interrupting. Then she said, Helix Agrary will try to classify the seeds as registered biological property and your farm as contaminated ground. If they get first custody, you will never see the seeds again. Dallin said, then there is no law. There is always law, Grace said. The question is who paid to write it. Wesley liked her immediately. Can Earth hold them? He asked. Maybe. There is an emergency shelter clause for living biological evidence attached to a refugee claim. It was written for pollinator colonies, not seed lines, but it might work. What does it take? An Earth citizen must accept temporary responsibility for the living material and the refugees connected to it. The property where it is held becomes the shelter site until review. Ruth looked at Wesley. Wesley already knew. Grace continued. If you sign and the claim fails, Helix can pursue damages. The county can quarantine the farm. The bank can accelerate foreclosure. You could lose everything. Wesley nodded. Grace's eyes softened. I need you to understand what I said. Edo. Mr. Ford, understanding and signing are not the same. No, Wesley said, but they're standing pretty close today. Before Grace could answer, the barn doors rattled. Victor Sloan had returned, and this time the fight had reached Wesley's yard. This time he did not come alone. 2 Helix technicians stood behind him with sealed cases. Paul Wren came again in the county truck, looking as if he had slept badly. A representative from County Trust Bank sat in a gray sedan near the road and did not get out. Sloan's voice carried through the barn. Mr. Ford, the time for informal cooperation has ended. Wesley stepped out, followed by Ruth, Frank, and Helen. Sarah stood just inside the barn with Noma behind her. Dallin leaned on Mira, pale but upright. Sloan glanced at the others. This property is under provisional containment notice. You are required to surrender the biological assets for safe removal. Grace's voice came from the video screen behind Wesley. This is Grace Holloway, counsel for Wesley Ford and the Vay family. Sloan paused. The Vay family is under Helix contract restriction. They are requesting humanitarian shelter on Earth. They are transporting stolen property. Helen stepped forward. The root in that barn is evidence that your registration claim may be false. Sloan smiled, small and cold. A county teacher is making that determination. A farmer can tell when a plant is alive, Helen said. A teacher can tell when someone is trying to bury the lesson. Sloan's face changed just enough to show irritation. He opened his folder. Mr. Ford, your bank has authorized immediate review of this property status. If containment proceeds, your equipment may be sealed. Your crop loss will not be compensated. Your existing debt will remain. The bank representative looked down at his hands. Sloan took out the offer again. This is your last opportunity. Sign the transfer. Your farm survives. These individuals return to their proper authority. No one else here is harmed. Mira whispered something to Dallin. Noma held the jar. Sarah stepped out of the barn. We are not property, she said. Sloan turned to her. Miss Vay, you are in breach of agricultural movement restrictions. My grandmother kept a seed that belonged to her mother. Your grandmother retained registered stock. Your company registered it after you took it. That is an allegation. Sarah's voice shook, but she did not step back. The root is not an allegation. Sloan looked at Wesley. You are being used by desperate people who do not understand the scale of what they have done. Wesley thought of the offer, of dry roofs, of paid debts, of a pump that started every morning. He thought of his father's hands and the bank letter and the way Sarah had stood between him and the jar. When she could barely stand at all, he walked to his truck and opened the glove box. For a moment, everyone watched him. He came back with a worn folder. Inside was the deed copy for Ford Hollow Farm, creased, stained, and handled too many times. Grace's voice came through the screen. Mr. Ford? Wesley looked at the barn, then at Sloan. You wanted to buy my silence, he said. It is not for sale. He handed the deed copy to Ruth, who held it up to the video screen for Grace. I am signing, Wesley said. Grace did not smile. Once I file this, it cannot be pulled back easily. File it. Sloan's tone hardened. You are making a financial mistake. Wesley nodded. Probably. An illegal one. Maybe. You cannot shield stolen property with sentiment. Wesley looked past him at the fields. This is not sentiment. It is soil. Frank gave a low grunt of approval. Grace began reading the shelter statement aloud, so Wesley could repeat it for the recording. He did not make a speech. He did not talk about humanity. He stated his name, his property, the living seeds, and the family requesting shelter. His voice was rough but steady. When he finished, Sloan gestured to the technicians. They opened their cases. The devices inside unfolded like metal insects. One began to hum, and the sound made Sarah go pale. Sarah turned sharply toward the barn. It will burn the signal pattern. The root is too young. Wesley moved before anyone else did. He climbed onto the old tractor parked by the barn door, fired it up, and drove it across the entrance. The engine roared, coughed, then held. He lowered the front loader until the bucket scraped the ground. Paul Wren raised both hands. Wes, do not make this worse. Paul, that machine goes in there, the root dies. Sloan's voice cut through the engine noise. Interference will be documented. Good, Wesley said. Spell my name right. The technicians hesitated. Behind Wesley, Sarah took the jar from Noma. She walked into the open doorway where everyone could see her. In the tray behind her, the small pale root had entered the mud. It was almost nothing, only a thread and a beginning. Noma stepped beside her and spoke in the language of Orvanna. The words rose and fell like rows being named in a field. Sarah translated, not for Sloan, but for the people standing in the mud. My grandmother says this seed was called First Return. It was planted after floods. It was kept by families, not companies. It fed Luma Field before Helix had a name. Sloan shook his head. Unverified oral tradition. Helen held up her field kit. Then let it be verified. Under Helix custody. No, Sarah said. Dallin leaned on Mira and stepped forward. We ran because every door was owned by them. We came here because no one else would let us stand long enough for the seed to speak. The yard was silent except for the tractor. Then Ruth Miller walked to the edge of the barn. She had a coffee can in her hand. Wesley had not noticed it before. She knelt with effort, scooped a handful of dark soil from the can, and placed it into the tray beside the Orvanna mud. "This is from my West acre," she said. "It is clean. It is mine. I am putting it there." Sloan stared. "Ma'am, you are contaminating evidence." Ruth stood. "No, I am joining it." Frank Bell walked to his truck, came back with dirt wrapped in an oily rag, and added it to the tray. "From my mother's garden," he said. Helen Ward added soil from a sample bag. "From a school greenhouse." Paul Wren looked at the county notice in his hand. His jaw worked. Then he walked to the roadside ditch, scooped wet earth in both palms, and carried it to the barn. "From the county road," he said quietly. "Public ground." One by one, the neighbors who had gathered at the lane came forward. Not many. 7, then 10, then 12. Poor farmers, retired hands, a feed store clerk, a woman who raised goats on land too rocky for corn. Each brought a handful of earth. No one shouted. No one raised a weapon. No one made a speech. They gave what farmers understood. Soil. Sloan's device hummed uselessly while the tray became something no contract had named. Not Helix property. Not just Wesley's risk. Not just the Vey family's burden. A shelter made of dirt. Grace's voice came through the screen, tight with urgency. "The emergency filing is received. Earth Provisional Review has attached to the case. Mr. Sloan, any removal now interferes with protected living evidence under a humanitarian shelter claim." Sloan turned toward the screen. "This is a misuse of statute," Grace said, "then challenge it in review. But you do not take that seed today." The root in the tray pulsed once. It was not bright. It was not dramatic. It was just alive. Sarah lowered the jar, and her hand stopped shaking. 3 weeks later, the north barn smelled different, and the change was small enough that only people who had waited for it could understand. It still smelled of old hay and oil. It still leaked in one corner. The heater still clicked in a way Wesley did not trust. But under the patched plastic, in trays made from scrap wood and feed bins, a row of small green plants leaned toward the morning light. Their leaves were thin and slightly translucent. When the sun hit them, they held the light for a breath before letting it go. Fort Hollow Farm was not saved in the way stories sometimes pretend farms are saved. The bank had not vanished. The roof still needed work. The tractor still started only when it felt respected. Wesley still woke before dawn with a list of problems longer than daylight. But the farm had not been sealed. The living seed shelter order had held. The first written order from Earth was only 6 pages long, but it gave the farm enough protection to breathe. Wesley did not understand all of it, and Grace did not pretend the fight was over. But one line mattered enough that Helen read it aloud twice. The seeds would remain where they were until an independent review could be completed. The Vey family would not be removed from Earth while the claim was active. Noma listened, then touched the barn wall with her palm. She did not say thank you. She stood a little straighter, and somehow that said more. Grace Holloway had turned the temporary claim into a formal review. Helen's report had drawn attention from Earth agricultural scientists, though Wesley made sure none of them stepped into the barn without washing their boots and listening to Sarah first. Helix Agrary had filed objections. Victor Sloan had called the shelter unlawful, emotional, and dangerous. He had not returned to the barn. The Vey family stayed in the farmhouse now. Noma slept in Wesley's mother's old room, where the morning sun came through lace curtains. Dallin was healing. Mira had taken over the kitchen with quiet authority and somehow made Wesley's pantry feel less empty than it was. Sarah spent most of her hours in the barn, where the seedlings had become strong enough to touch. On the 22nd morning, she called Wesley in before breakfast. Noma stood by the table with the old jar. Dallin and Mira stood behind her. Ruth, Frank, Helen, and Grace watched from the open barn door or the video screen. Sarah held a small cloth in both hands. "The first pods dried overnight," she said. Wesley stepped closer. In the cloth lay 6 new seeds. They were smaller than the ones in the jar, but clean. No dark spots. No corporate code burned into the shell. No mark except the faint green seam of life. Noma took the old jar from the shelf. For weeks, she had kept it wrapped. Now she unwrapped it completely. The jar was plain clay, scratched at the rim, stained by years of hands and smoke and travel. Noma washed it with warm water and dried it with a towel. Then she set it open on the table. Open, not clutched to her chest, not hidden under cloth, not guarded like a body. Open, like any seed jar should be. Sarah placed 3 of the new seeds inside. Then she placed the other 3 into a small cloth pouch Mira had sewn from one of Wesley's old work shirts. Noma took a pencil and, with slow care, wrote 2 lines on a tag. The first line was in the script of Orvanna. The second was in English. For the next season, Wesley looked at the words until they blurred. "Where will it go?" he asked. "Home," Sarah said. "Not all at once. Not loudly, but home." Noma touched the pouch. Luma Field will remember what to do. Outside, the fields of Ford Hollow were still scarred from the storm. The North Field would take time. The South Rise had been partly sacrificed to save a seed from another world. No one looking from the road would think the place had won anything. But in the barn, a row of green leaves held sunlight in their veins. Ruth wiped her eyes and pretended she had dust in them. Frank cleared his throat and said the heater still sounded wrong. Helen laughed softly. Grace, from the screen, said nothing for once. Sarah stood beside Wesley at the barn door. The morning wind moved across the wet fields and into the shelter, carrying the smell of mud, oil, old wood, and young leaves. "When we fell," Sarah said, "I thought Earth was only where the pod stopped." Wesley watched the light touch the open jar. Most places are just places until someone opens a door. Sarah looked at the fields where neighbors had walked through mud with handfuls of soil. And after that, Wesley put his hands in his coat pockets. The bank still had his number. The pump still needed watching. The farm still asked more from him than it gave back. But behind him, the jar was open. In front of him, the first row of Orvanna green stood under an earth morning. After that, he said, "It depends who is willing to stand in the doorway." No one spoke for a while. The pouch for Luma Field rested on the table beside the open jar. The new seeds waited inside it, light as breath and heavy as a promise. And for the first time since Noma Vey had wrapped the jar in torn cloth and run from her own sky, the last free seeds of Orvanna were not being carried away from something. They were being sent toward a season. And maybe that was what the galaxy had forgotten. A seed was never just a seed. It was tomorrow. It was memory. It was the right of a poor family to believe that one bad season did not have to be the end of their people. Wesley Ford did not save Orvanna with a fleet, or a throne, or a speech that shook the stars. He saved it with muddy hands, a broken farm, an old shed, and one stubborn patch of earth that he refused to surrender. Because sometimes the last sanctuary in the galaxy is not a palace or a fortress. It is a small human farm at dawn, where a jar finally sits open on a wooden table and the first free seeds wait for the next season. If this story stayed with you, please leave a like, share it with someone who loves stories about courage and kindness, and subscribe to the channel for more science fiction stories about humanity standing where no one else will. And if you want, tell me in the comments what you would have done if that escape pod had landed in your field. Thank you for listening. Until the next story, keep your door open, keep your heart steady, and never forget what one small act of mercy can grow into.